That hand from Washington. In 1910, a great Virginia statesman warned that a federal income tax would enable a hand from Washington to stretch out and destroy liberty and constitutional government. In 1964, a mechanic sits in a Kansas jail without bond and without formal charges against him because he tried to resist internal revenue search and seizure procedures which violate the Fourth Amendment. He was denounced by a federal judge for standing on his constitutional rights. Most taxpayers obey illegal orders of the federal bureaucracy because they are afraid, and they have good reason to be. Those who fight to uphold constitutional principles do so at frightful cost in time, money, and reputation. The remedy is to repeal the 16th Amendment, which authorizes a federal income tax. That would be done if Congress would repeal the withholding law and let wage earners realize how much tax they are paying. That is a summary of my report on That Hand from Washington. The full report after a message from my sponsor. Thomas Waller of Wichita, Kansas is a handicapped war veteran. Since his honorable discharge from the Army, he has operated a one-man independent business doing home repair work. The most he has ever grossed in any one year is $3,300. Like all such men trying to make a living as self-employed persons in their own trade, he has borne the heavy burden of keeping complicated records for the federal government. Without resources to hire tax experts and accountants, he has done his best, faithfully reporting and paying his federal income tax. In December 1963, he received a summons from the Internal Revenue Service ordering him to appear with all his records. This meant shutting down his business for a day, losing work, income, and possibly customers. The peremptory orders contained the usual threats of the arrogant bureaucracy, threats of fine, seizure of his property, and prison sentence for failure to comply. In issuing such orders, Internal Revenue Service meets none of the constitutional requirements specified in the Fourth Amendment to protect citizens against arbitrary search and seizure. There have been many frightening cases. For example, in March 1962, about 30 Internal Revenue Service agents moved into the post office at Fordyce, Arkansas, and started ordering taxpayers to bring in their records for audit. The revenue agents called in about 1,000 people, 10% of the total population of the county. The business and social life of the community virtually stopped. What were the revenue agents looking for? They never did say. They filed no charges and made no specific accusations against anyone. They virtually took over the town, ruining business for a month, causing economic hardship for the whole population, saying merely that they were conducting an experiment. Taxpayers generally obey the tyrannical orders of the Internal Revenue Service because they are afraid, and they have good reason to be afraid. If they resist orders of the revenue agents, they will be stigmatized as tax dodgers trying to cheat their government, and they will be subjected to reprisals by the Internal Revenue Service. Very few taxpayers can afford to resist. The cost in time and money would bankrupt most. Indeed, wealthy men, innocent of any attempt to cheat on their income tax returns, have been ruined by the Internal Revenue Service. Any man who stands on his constitutional rights and tries to resist illegal orders issued by the Internal Revenue Service is an exceptional person. Thomas Waller, the disabled veteran who made a living as a home repair mechanic in Wichita, is such a person. Waller shut down his one-man business and appeared at the tax office as ordered, but failed to bring his records, correctly contending that no proper subpoena had been issued. Tax agents got a court order. Waller answered the court summons on May 7, 1964, but again did not bring his records, again correctly contending that no proper constitutional subpoena had been issued. What was the federal court's reaction to Mr. Waller's stand on constitutional principles? Here is the lead paragraph from a news story in the May 8, 1964 issue of the Wichita, Kansas Eagle, reporting on Mr. Waller's day in court. Quote, "In fiery courtroom oratory that left witnesses open-mouthed, U.S. District Judge Wesley Brown lashed out at persons who claim constitutional immunity to avoid paying income taxes." End quote. Mr. Waller was not claiming constitutional immunity. He was not trying to evade payment of tax. In fact, he had already paid more taxes than he owed. He was merely trying to resist unconstitutional search and seizure procedures of the Internal Revenue Service. Waller was sent to jail without bond and without formal charges against him. to remain there indefinitely until he surrenders his records in compliance with an order issued in violation of requirements clearly specified in the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Mr. A.K. Summers, president of Premier Photo Service in Parkersburg, West Virginia, is also currently waging a costly and apparently losing battle against tyrannical procedures of the Internal Revenue Service. Mr. Summers' fight involves the withholding law, which requires all employers to serve as unpaid tax collectors and bookkeepers for the federal government, subjecting them to heavy penalties, including imprisonment, if they make any mistakes, however innocent. The withholding law is clearly unconstitutional. It imposes involuntary servitude without pay and enormous expenses without compensation on all employers, in violation of the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery or involuntary servitude. The law requires employers to deduct federal income tax from wages and to deposit the taxes once a month in a depository bank for the federal government. Mr. Summers has always been prompt in making the monthly deposits of all taxes collected. In January 1962, however, he changed his collection procedures. Here, in his own words, is what he did and why he did it. Quote, "Business people in West Virginia are required to collect a consumer sales tax for the state, pay into the Unemployment Compensation Fund the entire amount of the benefits, pay a gross sales tax from the gross amount of business done, regardless of whether they make a profit or not. Of course, we have to collect the withholding tax and Social Security for the federal government. We found all of this very time-consuming and expensive. The straw that broke this camel's back arrived when, in 1961, the state of West Virginia passed a personal income tax, which not only increased our tax load, but created another free collection job for the tax spenders. We decided that we could save 75% of the cost of computing these taxes by doing it only 12 times a year instead of 52. So we instituted the once-a-month withholding plan. The plan is quite simple. Beginning the first of every month, we pay everyone the full week's pay and figure no taxes. This continues through the third week. The fourth week of the month, we compute all the taxes for the whole month and take them out of that 1 week's pay." End quote. Mr. Summers' once-a-month withholding plan had a startling effect on his employees, 65 of them. He gives a specific example, quote, "Mrs. A, whose salary is $125 a week, under the system of weekly deductions would draw $99.29 a week, and she just took it for granted that what she was making. Under our system of collection now, she draws $125 each week for the first 3 weeks of the month, and the last week, $22.60. 3 weeks, she actually received $125. She had it in her hands and was able to spend it. Now she realizes she pays in taxes almost a full week's pay out of a month." End quote. Some of his employees pay more than 1 full week's pay out of each month. Mr. Summers says that one of his $70 a week employees gets no check at all for the 4th week of each month and still owes the federal government $4.75 for the month. The once-a-month withholding plan, receiving publicity, inspired a national effort to encourage other employers to try the plan. Mr. Summers got additional publicity for participating in this effort. In February 1964, the Internal Revenue Service ordered Mr. Summers to abandon his once-a-month withholding procedure, threatening to impose on him an excessively burdensome system not imposed on other employers if he did not comply, and also threatening him with fine and imprisonment. Mr. Summers filed a civil action in federal court, seeking to restrain Internal Revenue Service from taking such punitive action against him, since he has always punctually deposited all withheld taxes monthly, just as all other employers do. Summers had his day in federal court at Wheeling, West Virginia on May 11, 1964. He learned that a citizen cannot test the constitutionality of a federal law unless the federal government consents to having it tested. A citizen cannot test in the courts the legality of an IRS administrative action against him. His only recourse is to violate the Internal Revenue Service order and then defend himself when the government institutes criminal proceedings. If he wins, he will prove that the government should not have harassed and prosecuted him in the first place. If he loses, he goes to prison. In 1910, when the 16th Amendment authorizing the federal income tax was before the states for ratification, Richard Byrd, Speaker of the Virginia House of Delegates, warned that a federal income tax would enable a hand from Washington to stretch out and destroy liberty and constitutional government. 49 years later, 1959, the House Ways and Means Committee held formal hearings on the federal taxing system. Witnesses generally agreed that the federal tax system is an appalling mess of complicated inequities. It stifles initiative, wastes human energy and resources, distorts the national economy, and has a corrupting effect on both taxpayers and tax collectors. Individual efforts to challenge the illegal power of the federal bureaucracy are made at frightful cost to the individuals. Those who know and care have a solemn responsibility to help. Help by doing their utmost to educate other Americans to the truth of what is happening to our country. When enough Americans know and care, they will elect to the National Congress men who understand and respect the principles of liberty. Such a Congress would repeal the unconstitutional withholding tax law. It would propose a constitutional amendment to repeal the 16th Amendment and to prohibit the federal government from operating businesses in competition with its own citizens. I am Dan Smoot. Goodbye. God bless. For the documented text of this broadcast, send 25 cents to Dan Smoot, Dallas 14, Texas, and ask for 456, that hand from Washington. 6 copies, $1.